But woe's me, and woe's me, for the secret of her eyes. In my visions fearfully they are ever shown to be as fringed pools, whereof each lies pallid dark beneath the skies of a night that is but one blear necropolis, and her eyes a little tremble in the wind of her own sighs.
That excerpt is typical of Francis Thompson's lachrymose and often melancholic beauty which he pours into his language. Thompson's life and art seem to bleed into each other so much they almost become indistinguishable. He was on the threshold of a dying century where artists, consumed by their own romanticist yearnings, were at the height of their powers. Thompson's story started here in Preston, and his calling to write true poetry in its highest form would lead him through the very gates of hell itself. Francis Joseph Thompson was born on the 16th of December 1859 at number 7 Winkley Street in Preston. He was baptised into the Catholic faith at his local church of St Ignatius, which is now the Syro-Malabar Cathedral of St Alfonso, in St Ignatius Square, where the family had lived prior. Thompson's family at this point were newly converted Catholics, and impressed upon him a strong religious sentiment that moulded his personal philosophy. The Thompsons were comfortably middle class, as his father was a doctor of homeopathy, and they enjoyed a pleasant view of Winkley Square Gardens, where Francis, as a child, would often go to play. From a young age, he appeared an imaginative and extremely precocious child, albeit also a painfully shy and anxious one. His mother, always fostering his creativity, encouraged him to draw, paint and read. It was, for better or worse, a happy childhood. At 11 years old, he enrolled at Usual College, Durham, a Catholic seminary, to train to be a priest. It was there he began writing and started collecting notebooks, a hobby that would last throughout his life. At Usual, he was often found to be in a library, nose deep in a book and in a world of his own design, catalysed by an ever-growing appreciation for poetry, history, Shakespeare and the ancient classics. He was a successful student, winning many essay prizes and a lover of cricket. Quiet and obedient, he was content to slink into the background of things to focus on what made him happy, his own imagination. Yet there was a persistent observation by his teachers of Thompson being lazy, temperamental, and too shy for his own good. At 17, these tensions born within him came to a crisis point. His desire to become a priest fell away after years of poetry, art, and other pagan things eroded his religious conviction. To him, an ideal of God now became synonymous with an ideal of art. The shift in focus caused insurmountable guilt. His family wanted him, the only son among 2 other daughters, to succeed and provide for himself. After leaving Usual, he jumped, perhaps too quickly, into medicine. In 1877 he entered Owens College, Manchester, to train as a surgeon. Safe to say he met the minimum of what was asked of him while he studied there. Life as a medical student did not interest him, and he was disgusted and horrified by it at times. The human dissections especially gave him nightmares. His mother did 2 things that would affect Thompson's life irrevocably. She gave him at his request the biography of Thomas de Quincey, a controversial romantic author entitled Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which was one of the first modern drug memoirs. And then she died. It came at a terrible time as he had just failed his exams. He sank, understandably, into a deep depression. Thompson soon became an obsessive devotee of de Quincey's. He must have excused his dangerous interest in the book as mere appreciation for the colourful language the author used. Laudanum, the milk of the poppy, is central to the book's extravagance. De Quincey sang its praises and revelled in using the drug to create art. His beloved poppy was well known and used by nearly every class. Thompson became alarmingly inspired by the allure of the drug. His character was beginning to change. He became withdrawn from others, shut himself up in his room whenever he visited home, stayed out late at concerts, and drifted through Manchester's bookshops, galleries and museums, muttering continuously to himself. Even stranger, he fell in love with a statue at the Manchester Art Gallery. A pervading indifference to all things not artistic began to sink its claws deep into his mind. By 1884 he had dropped out of Owens College. This sudden decline was due to his increasing intake of laudanum, to a point where he would disappear for days at a time. Things inevitably went from bad to worse, and in 1885, after a bitter argument with his father about his prospects, he left his family home and ran away, not knowing he would never return there. Thompson fled to London. He decided to make his own pilgrimage into the gaping, hellish maw of the capital. By 1886, the city had spat him out onto the streets. He was homeless. The demands of hunger and the dangers of street living were made all the more worse by his continuing addiction. He fell back onto his old habits and often went to galleries and museums, the National Gallery being his favourite. There's a small but poignant tale of Thompson overhearing two women being baffled by a Renaissance painting, The Procession to Calvary by Ghirlandaio, and correcting them on who St. Veronica was and her unique symbolism. They recoiled and were disgusted by his intervention. He was taken in by a kind Protestant at one point, and even had time to write. However, his addiction soiled the opportunity, and he was kicked out. Another harsh rebuttal. All we know in this long period of his homelessness is the few fragments he wrote about in later life, and the state of the notebooks he kept during this time. He sold matches, called for cabs, scavenged for tobacco from tossed cigarette butts, and God knows what else to survive. Then fate seemingly parted the bleak storm around him. In 1887 he was taken in by a female sex worker into her lodgings and nursed back to health. They became constant companions, and Thompson was given a reprieve from the streets. Inseparable, passionate, and conjoined by their shared love of beauty and the hardships of the world. It can hardly be stressed enough that this woman saved Thompson from the brink of death. It is obvious she meant a great deal to Thompson. He never condemned her for her occupation, and her memory is enshrined within his poetry.
Forlorn and faint and stark, I had endured through watches of the dark, the abashless inquisition of each star, yea, was the outcast mark of all those heavenly passage scrutiny, stood bound and helplessly for time to shoot his barbed minutes at me, suffered the trampling hoof of every hour in night's slow led car, until the tardy dawn dragged me at length from under those dread wheels, and bled of strength.
I waited the inevitable last, then there came past a child like thee, a spring flower, but a flower, fallen from the budded coronal of spring, and through the city streets blown withering she passed, O brave, sad, lovingest, tender thing, and of her own scant pittance did she give, that I might eat and live.
In 1888, still plagued by guilt and the horrors he saw on the streets, and in his nightmares, he began to think of suicide. A rather gruesome and morose piece of poetry from this period survives, though was never published, entitled The Nightmare of the Witch Babies.
2 witch babies. Ha ha. 2 witch babies. Ho ho. A bedomen-ridden hag with the devil, pigged alone, begat them late at night on the bloody, rusted stone, and they dwell within the land of the bare shank bone, where the evil goes to and fro. 2 witch babies. Ho ho ho. What is it, sees he? Ha ha. There in frightfulness. Ho ho. There he saw a maiden, fairest fair. Sad were her dusk eyes, long was her hair. Sad were her dreaming eyes, misty her hair, and strange was her garment's flow. 2 witch babies. Ho ho ho.
It was around the time of this poem's creation that he attempted suicide in Covent Garden by taking a heavy dose of laudanum. Before, or during this attempt, a vision of Thomas Chatterton, a famous poet who had killed himself a century prior in the same city and by the same method, intervened. This hallucinatory spectre of the ill-fated poet, or perhaps the sudden memory of Chatterton's life, was enough to pull Thompson back to reality. Till this point, Thompson's literary ambitions had never been realised. He had tried again and again to submit his work to be published, but was rejected. He posted a manuscript in the months before his suicide attempt to a liberal Catholic periodical called Merry England in 1887. Attached to the dirty and densely annotated manuscripts was a letter addressed to the journal's editor, Wilfred Meynell. It read,
Dear Sir, In enclosing the accompanying article for your inspection, I must ask pardon for the soiled state of the manuscript. It is due not to slovenliness, but to the strange places and circumstances under which it has been written. I do not desire the return of the manuscript, regarding your judgment of its worthlessness as quite final. I can hardly expect that where my prose fails, my verse will succeed. Apologizing very sincerely for my intrusion on your invaluable time, I remain, yours with little hope, Francis Thompson. Kindly address your rejection to Charing Cross Post Office.
The letter is heartbreaking to read and looks to have been written on paper torn out from a book. The package contained nearly all of Thompson's best work to date, and he decided to condense it all in such pitiful words.
Wilfred Meynell, the person the letter was addressed to, was the epicentre of Catholic journalism. It took him almost 3 months to look at the letter and manuscripts again. Supposedly, while tossing rubbish into his fire, he had come across Thompson's work and read it. Excited, he showed his wife Alice Meynell, a talented writer and editor in her own right, and they both agreed that they would publish the visionary work they had just found. They sent a letter to the post office Thompson listed, but no answer came. In the months after, they decided to publish one of Thompson's poems for their Easter issue, to try and coax him out, as their attempts to find him were fruitless. A family friend of the Thompsons, Father John Carroll, immediately noticed Thompson's poetry appearing in Merry England. He sent a letter to Thompson, with money to make himself look presentable, with a plea for him to go to their offices and inquire for work. Thompson seemingly did not. Meynell, perhaps concerned or irritated, put up a small reward for Thompson to reach his office. Dirty, barefooted, with a mildewed coat and no shirt on, he finally turned up. He was too scared even to open Meynell's door. The moment Thompson had waited for had arrived. A wage was discussed, possible lodging, and a desire to meet again soon. After their first couple of meetings, Thompson rushed to tell the woman what had happened. But the woman already knew what was happening. Thompson was refusing to let go of her and return to society. In a cruel, miserable, but ultimately heroic way, the woman suddenly absented herself from Thompson's life, not wishing to get in the way of his future. She simply vanished, and was never found again. Thompson desperately searched for her for months. His muse had gone, but would be immortalised forever in his work. Her name, to this date, is still unknown. Eventually, Thompson gave himself over to the Meynell's care. His voyage into the depths of hell had finally come to an end.
Meynell decided Thompson must be kept busy to avoid him relapsing, and so enlisted him to review works for his magazine and some other periodicals he had connections with. Thompson, after enduring a gruesome bout of cold turkey for 6 weeks, in hospital, began to flourish under Meynell's watchful eye. He was suddenly becoming the thing he most aspired to be, a writer.
Nevertheless, he relapsed, as the drug was still highly available to him in London. Meynell suggested an escape to the countryside would help. Thompson was sent to a Catholic monastery in Storrington, Sussex, to recuperate, write, and avoid temptations. Whilst there, he had a breakthrough. In his newfound clear mental state, and wrote a remarkably vivid poem called Ode to the Setting Sun, and his now famous magnum opus, The Hound of Heaven.
I fled him. Down the nights and down the days, I fled him. Down the arches of the years, I fled him. Down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind, and in the midst of tears, I hid from him, and under running laughter. Up vistayed hopes I sped, and shot precipitated down titanic glooms of chasmed fears from those strong feet that followed after. But with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic intimacy, they beat, and a voice beat more instant than the feet. All things betray thee, who betrayest me.
Whilst working on his new poems, he also experimented with essay writing. He wrote one entitled Nature's Immortality, tackling the purest ideal of nature, which he was highly suspicious of. It is often haunting with its candid expression.
You speak, and you think she answers you. It is the echo of your own voice. You think you hear the throbbing of her heart, and it is the throbbing of your own. I do not believe that nature has a heart. and I suspect that, like many another beauty, she has been credited with a heart because of her face. You go to her, this great, beautiful, tranquil, self-satisfied nature, and you look for sympathy? Yes. The sympathy of a cat sitting by the fire and blinking at you. What indeed does she want with a heart or brain? She knows that she is beautiful, and she is placidly content with the knowledge. She was made to be gazed on, and she fulfills the end of her creation.
Becoming tired of the countryside, he moved back to London and decided to throw himself into the life of a journalist. Always writing for Merry England, he became an avid literary reviewer and essayist, a persistent critic on religious and social issues, especially the rights of the poor, and an advocate of reform. By 1892, Thompson, now overexerting himself with work, was once again taking laudanum. Again, he was sent by the Maynolds to a monastery for his health, this time in Flintshire, Wales. Wales, like Storrington, reawakened his imagination, and he was able to set about publishing his own poetry after having made a name for himself. His first volume, Poems, was published in 1893. All the while Thompson was becoming a professional author, he was still struggling to find stability in his poetic outpourings. In 1895, he published another collection called Sister Songs, and by 1897, his most extensive collection, New Poems, came out, which received little notice. He continued working right up until his death. From his own medical knowledge, he concluded he was dying of beriberi disease, a vitamin B1 deficiency. Others have speculated that he had died of tuberculosis. He was most likely suffering from withdrawal symptoms. He died on the 13th of November 1907 at St John and St Elizabeth Hospital, surrounded by friends. The funeral service was small and quiet, as per his requests. Adding to the mystery of his life, he left very few possessions behind, other than a metal trunk filled with notebooks, letters and manuscripts, a toy theatre he had kept from his childhood in Preston, and some old pipes. He had no money to his name, a fitting end for a deeply spiritual man. No footprints left behind. At his death, the famous Catholic author and critic G.K. Chesterton said, "With Francis Thompson we lose the greatest poetic energy since Browning. In his poetry we find the poetry of the universe." Thompson's fame soared after his death due to the carefully cultivated image the Maynolds crafted of him. After the First World War, however, like most Victorians, he was forgotten about. Yet, his legacy did return to influence other artists and people. At the end of it all, Thompson achieved what he always wanted, to be a true poet. His poetry is still read to this day, but is still occupying a small space in the canon of English literature. Whilst many of his own generation saw themselves as a return to nature, he saw himself as a return to God, a return to the infinite. The Preston-born poet Francis Thompson again and again continues to surprise me. Not only does his tragic life intrigue me, his literary outpourings seem to twist and turn at every moment. Even in death, Thompson still seems to be chanting his dreamlike hymns into the world, the echoes of which are still reverberating.